Thank you so much for being here for today's webinar that will introduce our probiotic toolkit. We've been working on this for a long time and we're really excited to share it with you all today. We work hard at the NEC Society to keep babies and families centered in everything that we do. And today's webinar is dedicated to baby Ezra, who you see here on your screen. Ezra was born 10 weeks prematurely and was diagnosed with necrotizing enterocolitis. And despite his incredible strength and his parents' love, he tragically died from. And we are so grateful to his family who have been working really hard to support efforts to raise awareness and raise funds so that we can accelerate NEC research, education, and advocacy, help families like theirs and babies like Ezra. So I know that you all will join me in Ezra in your heart today and always. And again, thank you to Ezra's family for to dedicate today's webinar to their sweet boy. So we will go ahead and get started. If anyone is just getting to know the NEC Society, welcome. We are so excited to have you. The NEC Society is a 501c3 charity organization. Our vision is a world without necrotizing enterocolitis. And we do this, we work towards our vision by bringing together families who've been personally affected by the disease, clinicians, researchers, and others who care. And we work hard to accelerate NEC research, education, and advocacy. And we work hard, again, to center babies and families in everything that we do and to have a focus on equity and collaboration. What drives the NEC Society really is most the babies and families. They drive and compel us to do what we do today. But apart from that, we believe in the really urgent need to improve the science, to accelerate the research. We believe in sharing resources and making sure that information is equitably available. Speaking of equity, that's one of our fundamental values as well, is really advocating so that all families and babies can have access to the best care so that they can live. Many of you know that May is NEC Awareness Month and May 17th was NEC Awareness Day. And in fact, we are really excited to share that the state of California just resolution to declare May 17th as NEC Awareness Day. So that was a really exciting that we celebrated here in the state of California, where I am, and we look forward to encouraging more states to join us in recognizing NEC Awareness Day next year and beyond. So if you're interested, you'll reach out and collaborate with us on raising awareness about this devastating disease. So we are going to have a few questions scattered throughout this webinar. And the first is, how have you recognized NEC Awareness Month? So if you can take a moment to either scan the QR code, or you can go to that website and enter the code and share how you've been recognizing NEC Awareness Month, that would be great. And I'm gonna see if it's gonna let me, there we go. Hopefully display the answers. Give everyone a moment to answer before I move to the next slide. Raising awareness, thank you. Sharing our personal stories. There's been a lot of family stories that we've highlighted on our social media platforms. The NEC Society is on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. So it's been really amazing to see the stories. Some of them are tragic and absolutely heartbreaking, but they really compel us to keep going and inspire us to do this work every day. And again, thank you to all the families who have been sharing their stories with us. It really helps to humanize the disease and demonstrate the need to advance the research. Awesome. Thank you to everyone who's been donating and raising funds for us, telling others about the NEC Society. This is fabulous. And I know that a lot of our clinicians have been raising awareness in their unit with their staff team, so that's been great. All right, thank you for taking the time to answer. I'm going to move to the next slide. There we go. So I always like to share our research priorities that we developed last year, and they really serve as our research roadmap and help us to understand how we should really prioritize the limited resources and funds and capacity that we have to do this work, so that we're always focusing on the most urgent and impactful and meaningful research topics that matter most to our patient families and our clinicians and the community members. So we believe that our probiotic toolkit falls in line with a lot of the research priorities and topics that you see here. And I hope you will continue to use our research priorities to understand the work that we're doing and perhaps even inspire the work that you're doing. Before I forget, I will just mention that if you have questions at any time during the webinar, please use our Q&A tool that's there in the little screen. We'll be monitoring the Q&A, and we will be sure to address your questions either in our panel discussion or our audience discussion time. So I just want to mention, many of you have probably seen this. We published our statement on probiotics not too long ago, and it really focuses on how communication is really essential in the NICU with patient and families, and how families need to understand different topics that are relevant to their child's health, including probiotics. So whether centers are using probiotics or not using probiotics, families really need and deserve to know what the rationale and the logic is behind that, so that families can have that information and really be part of the care team and help to advocate for their child. So our statement on probiotics really is kind of sets the foundation for what now we are sharing with you is our toolkit. So if you haven't read our statement on probiotics, I encourage you to do that. You can go to our website, necsociety.org, and you can check out our statement on probiotics there. And I just like to emphasize that while at this time we cannot eliminate all the risks of NEC, there are ways that we can meaningfully reduce the risk of NEC, and we believe that we need to, because babies continue to be diagnosed and die from this disease every day. And so some of you might be wondering, like, why did we even develop a toolkit? What is it, what is it for? How can centers use it? And I first want to emphasize, and I think we will all, our panelists today, we will all emphasize that this toolkit is really meant for centers and clinicians to be able to use to navigate the decision on whether probiotic use is right for them and their unit. But we believe that this was a necessary tool for us to develop, because there was really a gap in the community that we believe this toolkit now fills. We believe that it's critical to learn from each other, so that we're not duplicating efforts and replicating mistakes and problems that other people have already figured out how to solve. So the toolkit really allows us to learn from one another and share our lessons and avoid obstacles that, again, other people have already figured out how to navigate. It also ensures equitable access to information, because some centers are able to, have information and understand the information that's in the toolkit, whereas other centers struggle a little bit more. So our probiotic toolkit, it is free. It's going to be available to anyone and anywhere to download, and it's not available yet on our website, but it will be very soon. You all are getting kind of first access to our toolkit today before we make it available. And so again, it really levels the playing field, and it centers the needs of babies and families. This toolkit is developed by the NEC Society, which is led by patients and families who've been personally affected by necrotizing enterocolitis, working hand in hand with our clinicians and our researchers. So that is why we developed the toolkit. And we just like to emphasize that just as you can have poor outcomes and unexpected outcomes if you quickly make decisions regarding care practices, that stalling also carries a risk. And it's fair to ask, what are the risks of inertia? What are the risks of using probiotics, and what are the risks of not using probiotics? Those are both fair questions that we believe need to be considered and asked and explored and addressed. So here are our learning objectives for today. We want to demonstrate how to use our probiotics toolkit. Erin Pryor, my colleague and friend here, is going to be walking you through that in just a moment. We are going to demonstrate and identify 4 clinical practices that can help to reduce NEC. And we want to help you understand why family engagement is so important, and ways that you can collaborate with patient families that the toolkit will help outline. I always forget to introduce myself, so let me just start by saying I'm Jen. I'm the founder and executive director of the NEC Society, and I'm here because my son Micah died from the disease just before his first birthday. He was diagnosed with NEC when he was 6 weeks old. He came home, we thought he had made it, and then tragically he died from complications of necrotizing enterocolitis. And I feel incredibly honored and inspired by all of you at the NEC Society and the community, and so again, really grateful to be part of this amazing movement and organization. My friend and colleague Erin Pryor is the NEC Society's research coordinator. She's going to be walking you through the toolkit that she's worked especially hard to get to where it is and to launch and be ready to share with you all today. Really excited for her to share this with you. And then Jay Kim, Adam Mason, Ravi Patel, and Mark Underwood, they've been involved in NextStudy for a long time, either on our board of directors, our scientific advisory council, and again, have just been collaborating and essential to the work that the NextStudy has been doing for many years. So really excited that each of them will share their unique perspective and expertise regarding our probiotic toolkit and how it can apply to you and your community and your centers. So that's who you will be hearing from today. It's important to just make it very clear that we are never providing medical advice, that all of our views are independent from the NextStudy as an institution, that we are not recommending that centers use or not use probiotics, and that we are never going to recommend or promote any particular product. So that is really important to make clear. But we are curious. If you are affiliated with a center, is your center using probiotics? So just kind of getting a feel for who is in our audience today and what your experience is like. So I'll give you all a moment to share your responses to this. And so if your center is already using probiotics, we would love to hear your thoughts, especially on the toolkit and perhaps, you know, other centers who might benefit from using the toolkit and how the toolkit resonates with your experience navigating the use of probiotics. And it looks like, I just want to mention, it looks like we have people who have raised their hands. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A chat tool. The chat box, we're not going to be monitoring quite as closely. So if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A tool. If you need to use the chat box, that works also, but again, would encourage questions and comments to go through Q&A if possible. Awesome. We'll give this another moment before I move to the next slide. Cool. Thank you for taking the time to respond to this. We'll have a few more live poll questions later on in today's webinar. So now I'm going to hand it over to Anne.
Thank you, Jen. It's truly an honor to be here. I'm super excited to share our work on probiotics. As Jen said, it's been a work in progress, and I'm excited to get it out there for you all to see. I want to thank the panel for being here as well. I'm looking forward to the discussion we'll have a little bit later. I'll be giving you an overview of the toolkit, the sections, and the content. But before I do, I wanted to share a little bit about my background in the NICU. In 2003, during my first pregnancy, I was diagnosed with HELLP syndrome and delivered my son at 31 weeks. And like so many others, I was thrusted into the NICU world unexpectedly and left to care for my son, but not only for him, but myself with the health complications that I had for quite some time after the birth. Thankfully, he did not experience NEC and did extremely well with no long-term complications. At the time I had him, I was working in nutrition research and was teaching community weight loss classes. And I knew that dietitians could work in NICUs, but it was never something that I wanted to pursue professionally. Neonatal nutrition was really foreign to me and unknown, but I felt the need to really give back and try to help the families and do something, anything to help them that go through the experience that I did. And so after that experience, I had a career change and was able to transition into a clinical role in the NICU for over 10 years. And I really thrived in this role. It was personally and professionally rewarding, and really proud of the work that I did there. The NICU that I worked in was a 60-bed level 3B NICU in a delivery hospital. We had several initiatives to improve mothers' milk feedings. We had a donor milk program. We used standardized feeding protocol, and we had an antibiotic stewardship protocol that we had revised several times over the years. But when probiotics would come up, whether it was by a physician or a parent asking, the answer was always, we didn't know enough, or the research wasn't there. And this was the same in my other NICU networks that I was in contact with. Everybody kind of just felt that it was new at the time, and we weren't ready to really discuss it yet. As the talk around probiotics increased over the years, my interest started to peak, but honestly, I just didn't have the time to commit to researching. There was so much information out there. There wasn't really any guidance as to how to implement them, what to use, strains, et cetera. And again, this wasn't unique to my unit. I was hearing the same from other NICUs, especially those in community-based areas, and not necessarily the children's hospitals, but we as a community center just didn't really have the time. And I struggled with this because as a preemie parent, I knew that answer wasn't good enough. And as a dietitian, I felt like it was my responsibility to really look into this. But by 2019, I was the only dietitian for 60 beds and really just had to devote all of my time to patient care. Now in my role with the NEC Society and as an organization, we have a great opportunity to provide not only information on probiotics, but an actual tool to help clinicians through the decision-making process. We felt that we can provide something that summarizes the research in an easy-to-read format, and that can serve as a guide from a patient-family perspective. And I would have loved to have something like this as a dietitian. So we're looking forward to it being helpful to the centers out there. It was developed with a team approach. Our staff and scientific advisory council, we met over several meetings with stakeholders. And although the toolkit is meant to be for clinicians in the NICU, we do always provide a patient-family perspective. And we recommend incorporating, as Jen said, patient families into the process, both through the decision-making and also how you communicate. As a parent, I want to be assured that treatments for disease prevention were not only considered, but well thought out. All right, so now I'm going to show you the toolkit and share my screen. All right, so this is a toolkit. I want to just state first, this is not a recommendation for or against the use of routine probiotics in the NICU. It is not for or against the use of any product or preparation. We realize there are new studies that will continue to come out on probiotics, and this is the most up-to-date information that we have at the time. Here you'll see the table of contents, which just gives an overview of the content sections. We have an introduction that discusses briefly NEC in general, the microbiome, potentially better clinical practices, and then probiotics use in the NICU, as well as the guidance from several professional organizations. The second half of the toolkit is really split into three main parts, with pre-work and implementation, or sorry, pre-work and preparation, protocol, and then implementation and beyond. It is an interactive toolkit. So I'm using Adobe Reader, and this is the 2-page view. Over here on the side, you can page up and page down. And then the tabs are actually interactive, so you can have quick access to the different sections that you're interested in viewing. All right, so before I go into this section, I want to note the resource links that we have throughout the toolkit. Down on the left-hand side, you'll see the box, and these are active links. So you'll be able to click and it will take you directly to the source that we're referencing in the text. So again, here in the introduction, we know that the pathophysiology of NEC is multifactorial. The literature has focused on areas of clinical practice to help reduce NEC, and we've highlighted them here. I think there are many things that impact NEC rates, and these potentially better practices should all be considered in your unit. We know that human milk, there's a lot of evidence on human milk and NEC prevention, antibiotic stewardship and feeding protocols. We provide literature on those. And then obviously the intention of this toolkit, of course, is to summarize the literature on probiotics and NEC prevention. Next, we have probiotics use in the NICU. And over on the left, this is a chart that shows the United States use over the last 2 decades. And you can see prior to 2000, there was little to no probiotics use in NICUs in the United States. You can see the increases generally happened around 2006, and then another increase again around 2014. This data we realize is a little bit outdated, but Gail Besner and her team at Nationwide Children's are currently working on an updated survey to survey clinical use in NICUs of probiotics, but also perceptions of clinicians. So we're looking forward to that publication to come out soon. We also have information on worldwide use. And then the last part of this section is really a summary of resources that relate to the clinically better practices that I mentioned. Resources on human milk feedings, including webinars, antibiotic stewardship, and then feeding protocol, standardizing and developing. The next section is on guidance. And here we summarize the available guidance from several professional organizations that have all been released statements in the last 3 years. We have the Next Society Statement on Probiotics, the AAP Clinical Report, the Canadian Pediatric Position Statement, ESPGHAN, the American Gastroenterological Association, and the WHO guidelines for preterm or low birth weight infants. And we provide just a summary and a direct resource link for each. All right, now I'm going to take you down to the pre-work section. Even if you use this toolkit and you go through the recommended steps in the pre-work section and decide that probiotics isn't something you want to implement right now, it's important that you go through this process so you can communicate with your staff and your patient families that you are intentional with the consideration and how and why you came to the decision. So first, we recommend forming a research and review team. And this should be multidisciplinary, including nursing, dietitian, pharmacy, maybe hospital leadership, anyone from your care team, and parents, if possible, from your family advisory council. We provide a pretty good summary of the literature for the research and review team to discuss, including several meta-analyses. The Cochrane review is highlighted first, the recent 2020 Cochrane review, 2 clinical trials that have been done, and then the recent Vaughan data analysis. We touch a little bit on other outcomes with probiotics, such as time to full feeds and growth, and neurodevelopmental impairment and additive effects. We also have several literature articles on safety risks and concerns with resources to direct you there. And then a list of considerations that will be specific to your unit. So obviously we know all units are different, but these are things that such as pharmacy, maybe pharmacy will own or nutrition will own. You need to decide who's going to own the policy and procedure. What are the storage considerations for the different types of products, facility layout, your mixing procedures, and staffing capability. And these all things can be discussed again with your research and review team. Of course, you'll need to consider cost analysis and budget. And then we recommend to seek feedback from your family advisory council as a whole for their perspective, and maybe consult other centers of similar size and level of care that use probiotics, and also your own hospital, legal, and IT teams. All right, so at this point, after your team has taken the time to discuss all the pre-work, and now it's time to make a decision. So if that decision is we're ready to go further to implement probiotics, the next part will take you further into that process. And before I go on here, I do want to note that the references in each section, we have them listed in each section as it relates to the content. Those are all clickable and they'll take you directly to the source. We also have a full list of resources at the end of the toolkit that are in alphabetical order. So the protocol section is really the how-to. We provide goals and outcome measures and a sample from a QI intervention that was done to reduce NEC by 30% in a 42-bed NICU. You can see the various measures that were followed there. We provide some examples of inclusion and exclusion criteria to consider. And choosing a product, and we all know this is the challenging part. There is no data or regulatory approval to support the superiority of a single product or strain. So we do not mention names in the toolkit. However, we have provided a list of resources and articles and actual studies that do name products and do talk about specific strains. So you can read and refer to those to get that information. Next, we provided 2 sample protocols. The institution names have been removed. However, these are 2 protocols that are actually in use. They vary slightly, but these are so you can see just kind of the differences and how units are using them. And I also recommend looking at the manufacturer's information for product specs and process information. And then also a microbiologist can be helpful, whether it's from your hospital or local university or health department, to talk about the specific strains. Lastly, we have implementation and beyond. So we encourage you to advocate for the decision if you're going to go through and implement. Some ideas in the checklist here are to identify unit champions. And I think one of the most important things at this point is to write a summary report for dissemination. This helps eliminate confusion amongst your staff. And also it's very important when communicating to your patient families to really all be on the same page. So everyone is aware of the process that you went through to get to your decision. We have tips on staff education. Again, dedicating a unit champion that can be available for nursing who's implementing, available for questions and knowledgeable about the implementation practices. And also we recommend providing the education in different formats. Patient and family communication is extremely important. And I think whether or not you choose to implement, even if probiotics is something you decided not to implement right now, be prepared to share your reasoning with your patient families. We believe clinicians and families should work together and always discuss the risks and benefits of any treatment. Give support for your reasoning, whether it's in communication and a written summary, and just be transparent with how you came to the decision why or why not to implement probiotics. We provided a set of questions over here on the right-hand side. You'll see to expect from your patient families, and these things you can be prepared to answer. We also provide a list of resources here, and one of them is a newly developed handout, Probiotics and Necrotizing Enterocolitis, What Parents Should Know. And this is all also clickable down here at the bottom. You can have a printable version to use when you're communicating with your patient families. The evaluation section is really just, we recommend an established evaluation process. We want to make sure you include at least some members from the research and review team that you had. So you have people that have been involved in the process throughout. And we have some evaluation markers for the team to continue to discuss after implementation has occurred. And that's really the basics of the toolkit. I hope that you find it helpful. My contact information is listed at the bottom, and we also have a way to provide feedback via a survey here. So we'd love for anyone that uses and downloads the toolkit and reviews it, we'd love your feedback. So Jen, I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. That was fantastic. And I know there's a lot of excitement to be able to access and see the toolkit for yourself. We are going to be sharing a link soon during this webinar. We'll share a link and you will be the first ones to have access to the toolkit. So shortly. So if you want to stop sharing your screen, Erin, we will transition to our panel discussion. And so what you'll be seeing now is everyone here asking each other questions and engaging in a conversation around probiotics and our toolkit. And so I first just want to recognize that, again, one of the reasons we developed this toolkit was so that our community could avoid duplicating efforts of spinning their wheels and really like replicating other people's mistakes that others have already solved. So I'm curious to hear from you all, so Jay, Ravi, and Mark, what have your experiences been regarding the implementation of probiotics? What have the challenges been, and how it relates back to the toolkit? So if you can share your own experience, I'm sure people would love to briefly learn from you all.
I'll start us off. So thanks, Jen, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. I think the first comment I'd make is just the concept of the toolkit itself, having worked on a nutrition toolkit when I was in California, and how powerful that is to kind of demystify and to clarify and to accelerate and take some of the messiness out of an area and help all parties, both on the clinical side and the patient family side, moving forward in a more concerted way. And probiotics is a hot mess, and I think that's why people struggle on all fronts. And just to give you my anecdote, when I came to Cincinnati about almost 4 years ago, there was a lot of resistance at that time within the 5 units that we have in using probiotics. Although one of the units had already established, was sort of the rogue unit, and had already started using probiotics then. And so we went through all the processes that Erin talked about, and I wish I had this toolkit at that time, because really it was inventing some of these steps along the way and trying to figure out how you gain traction with the group. And I'd say that's probably the major thing that was important, is just understand the room, understand the people, what was the resistance at the time, and what would help move them. And it involved all the things that are in this toolkit: getting the information, having grand rounds, discussing, having a lot of transparency about the process, and detailing the steps along the way, and it was a journey because it took the pandemic hit, so it didn't help, and then the AAP statement came out too, and there were some other issues when several products were on our top list, and how to manage that. But I just say that the biggest take home was really to map out that whole process in the unit. In the unit that we have, and all the team members, and get all the stakeholders and walk through it so that everyone's at the same stage and not jump too far and leave people behind.
I'll jump in next. I sure appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel, and especially to all the folks at the Next Society for the wonderful hard work that went into this toolkit, which I think is just fabulously organized. So special thanks to Aaron in terms of leading this process and shaping the final product. So my interest in probiotic goes back quite a few years. It's 20 years ago that I started our first probiotic clinical trial at UC Davis. And it was a time when there was limited evidence and even limited capacity for evaluating the intestinal microbiota. Things have changed a ton in the last 20 years, including the tools that allow us to look at what microbes are in the neonatal gut and what's normal, what's not normal. And I think there's still a lot to learn in every aspect of how the gut microbes influence the neonatal developing innate and adaptive immune system. So early on, we did a clinical trial where we chose 2 probiotics that were available over the counter. And we did a 3-arm trial, which brings its own challenges. One was placebo, one was probiotic 1, and the other was probiotic 2. And we had the luxury at my institution of being able to test each of those probiotics to make sure that what was on the label matched what was in the product. And we had the capacity to do some, for that time period, sort of cutting edge analysis of short chain fatty acids in the stool and evaluating what bugs were present in the stool. And so early on, the nurses in our NICU were sort of interested in this question. And so it was a process that with my colleagues over the subsequent several years got easier. Once we had done some clinical trials in preemies and then in term babies with gastroschisis and term babies with congenital heart disease, we as a unit made a decision based on the literature at the time available that we thought the evidence for benefit of probiotics significantly outweighed the risks. And so we then engaged or began the journey of starting a routine dosing of prophylactic probiotics. And over the years since then, we've used 2 different products. And we've been fortunate to be able to bank a whole bunch of stools and urine and plasma from kids from 2 different eras, probiotic 1 era and then probiotic 2 era. And that's allowed us to do some more interesting research over the years. So at my unit at UC Davis, the pharmacy was very invested and interested in supporting this. The IRB at our institution was very interested in the question. We were very fortunate to have a terrific neonatologist, one of my colleagues on the IRB, and that was helpful. The FDA was very interested in our approach and supportive as well. And so I think enlisting all of those interested folks and sharing with parents why we were doing what we were doing was helpful as we moved through the process.
I'll share our experience, and I wanted to echo first, just congratulations to the Next Society and Aaron for developing this toolkit. I think it's going to become very useful. And one of the things I would encourage the audience and the people who are using this is to really think with a fresh set of eyes about what the evidence is, because I think one of the things I remember very often being said, maybe 10 years ago, is there's just not enough evidence. There's, the evidence isn't there to support use. And I think evidence is constantly evolving and changing. And over the subsequent decade, there's been a lot of evidence, both from centers experience, individual centers experiences, reporting what's happened, but as well as the data from clinical trials and meta-analysis. And I would say take a fresh look, and I think the great part of this toolkit is it allows that first section, as very nicely pointed out, allows you to think about the evidence first, and it's always coming to weighing the risks and benefits. And I think from our own experience when we started, it was really thinking of, what's the current status in our units, and we had 100% human milk use. So it wasn't that we were not already doing things that were in place to try to reduce the risk of NEC, but even with that, we still had NEC rates that we felt could be improved. And our systems are designed exactly to achieve the results. And so if we kept doing what we're doing, it's likely that we would have continued to have NEC rates where they were. And really, if we wanted to reduce that, we had to think about what changes we could make. And I think that's where the discussion around probiotic supplementation started almost 10 years ago. And then it comes to weighing the risks and benefits and some of the considerations that the toolkit addresses. And some of those are going to be very context specific. What might be available on your formulary, who's managing cost, etc. But I think before getting into the details and sometimes getting stuck on, well, we don't know which product to use, I think it'd be first to review the evidence and just try to get to a sense of, is your group's decision to either start or maybe this isn't the right time, or maybe there's some uncertainty. And I think either approach you should be open to either conclusion, but to get to that first before then going and moving into some of the details about the protocol, and then the implementation, really to not get bogged down too quickly into the details and stop there, but really I think to think about whether the evidence in your current unit's context and perhaps the NEC rates in your units, whether those are things that really you think that there might be a point where your team, as you work through it, say, I think this is a time where we really should think about it. And then the next step is pointed out to really work on the protocol, which is what our experience was. And then finally the implementation. And then not to stop there, but actually to track your outcomes and to look at kind of the experience, both from a safety standpoint, if there's, as well as whether you're actually seeing a reduction in the outcomes you're trying to prevent. It can take some time. So I think for those centers that do that, there's limitations of centers with relatively small numbers of premature infants that it might take time to show a difference. And you have to trust always the evidence that's out there before you implement it. But those would be some of my initial comments.
Thanks so much to each of you. I want to see if Adam, if you want to share, your experience coming from a very different perspective around probiotics and your experience as it relates back to this toolkit that we are now sharing with the community.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. I think this toolkit is a wonderful tool that can be used, and I'll explain my perspective on that. I am a lawyer, and so what I'm going to say is not meant to be legal advice on any specific situation. So I need to say that up front. I got involved in this issue as a lawyer, representing Yale New Haven Hospital in a case, unfortunately, where a premature infant died as a result of a contaminated probiotic product that was administered in order to prevent necrotizing enterocolitis. And that situation was as tragic as that situation was. I'm glad to say that we have not seen a repeat of that. There has not been another reported incident of that outcome. So I'm happy to start at least from that perspective. But in coming into that case with really no knowledge of this subject, one of the things that struck me was, in representing the hospital, that we had to take apart what the hospital's approach was to deciding how to use probiotics. And then once they had decided that they were going to use probiotics, how it was that they were going to administer it. And that approach really was, it started literally from the moment the product was shipped to the hospital via UPS, and how it was stored in their garage, and how it was transferred from a truck to another storage area, and then how it was transferred from that storage area to the pharmacy, how it was stored in the pharmacy, how it was dealt with in the pharmacy, how it arrived up in the unit, how it was stored in the unit, how it was administered to the patients, and all of the little processes that happen in between. All of those were not only investigated by us because we wanted to ensure that the hospital was doing the right thing on all of those steps, but it was investigated by, of course, the plaintiff's lawyers, and by our co-defendants who were trying to figure out for themselves what really happened. And so without getting into too much detail at the moment, I would say what this toolkit really does is it presents you with the tool to start the process that we would then look into as lawyers later on. So if you follow the toolkit, if you use it, if you do those things, it makes our job, hopefully you never need us, but it certainly makes our job a lot easier because you have followed a process and you have looked at all of these things. And so for that reason, I think this is just a wonderful, wonderful resource and a great beginning for how centers can approach this issue.
That's really helpful, Adam. Thank you so much. I feel like, we've spent a considerable amount of time talking about, the centers that are already using probiotics. And so I'm curious for centers who are not using probiotics or who have chosen intentionally to not use probiotics, like how is the toolkit relevant to them and how can they use the toolkit if their center has chosen to not use probiotics, if they make that decision?
Maybe I could jump in on that one. I think one of the great benefits of this toolkit is the focus on bringing families into the discussion. I think your introductory comments and Aaron's follow-up comments really are right on point. Parents want to know why we do what we do, and they're very interested in all aspects of their baby's care, and the more involved they are, the better their babies do. And so this toolkit, I think, gives you an opportunity, whether as a NICU you decide to use probiotics or you don't, to improve communication processes with parents. I think we owe parents an explanation as to why we're using probiotics or why we're not. And we owe them some explanation as to what the risks and benefits are and why we have the degree of uncertainty that we do. And I think parents appreciate those frank and open discussions. And if you just don't ever discuss it, in the long run, that undermines confidence.
Absolutely agree, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Anything else you all want to add?
Yeah, I'd add to, I think, absolutely to Mark's point about involving parents, but also to make it an intentional approach, where it's not just a decision of a single person that might have a strong opinion, but actually to bring in stakeholders and kind of bring a team-based approach to that decision, which might end up being, we have reviewed evidence and we still stand with the approach of not using probiotics. It might be because we have very low NEC rates in our unit, and we might have to supplement this to a large number of infants to prevent that. That might be the decision that comes out of a team approach. But at least this toolkit in the first part particularly can make that a very intentional approach that might be documented, that maybe down the road might actually be helpful to say, we've gone through this and we went through the evidence and we had a very kind of structured approach to come to our decision to not use probiotics. So I think that can be helpful both in communicating with families when they ask if we're not doing it, but also in terms of just with your team to really say, we've gone through this and we reviewed this and this is, and we've looked at the updated evidence and this is still where we stand.
I would add my perspective there is there is unfortunately litigation around the issue of necrotizing enterocolitis. And unfortunately, a lot of that litigation arises because parents want to know what happened and they're looking for answers. And litigation can sometimes at least give them some idea of whether or not there was something that could have been done. So for centers who are not using probiotics, the good news there is that there have not been litigation so far accusing centers of or individual doctors of malpractice for not using probiotics. But there is a risk in any situation where you have somebody who passes away or needs surgery, that somebody might get in their idea, in their head that maybe I should sue, maybe I should try to find out. If you go through the process in the toolkit, what you're doing is you're setting up a reasonable, defensible position for why it is that you arrived at your conclusion that either you should or shouldn't be using probiotics. And you're doing that in advance. And so either way, from my perspective as a lawyer, it's important that centers engage in that process to mitigate the risk of finding themselves in court having to defend themselves.
Adam, can I ask a question of you on that area? Because one of the concerns when we survey people in different units is that there's units that have decided to use probiotics early and have started, and then there's units on the other side, and then there's a whole bunch of units that are in the middle that are sort of thinking about it and processing news and views and kind of trying to figure out how do they jump in, when do they jump in. So where does standard of care come in when, as the needle moves, that more units are starting to use it gradually over time, where it becomes sort of an actual meaningful representation of either majority or near majority of units are using it? How do you see that as an influencer?
Sure. So the way that litigation in this area would likely work is the plaintiff's bar, who would be bringing these cases, would have to find experts in the field who believe that use of probiotics, and particularly a particular product, is standard of care, number one. And number two, and this is where I think probably why they haven't brought these types of cases yet, is they would also at some point have to demonstrate, to prove that using probiotics would have actually prevented the harm to that particular baby. That is a very hard thing to do. I think all of us on this, on the panel, and I'm sure a lot of you out there in the audience understand that it would be very challenging to demonstrate that using probiotics in a particular child would have prevented them from having a problem. So those are the issues, and they would need expert testimony from somebody to say that there was a violation of the standard of care and that there is causation. And I think we're my own personal opinion, and this is myself speaking, is that we're pretty far away from an expert really credibly being able to say that there is a standard of care and we can demonstrate causation. And so to the extent that those of you out there are concerned about those things, concerned about litigation, I hope that would give you a little more comfort in that area, that you're not opening yourself up to, lawsuits if you go ahead and use probiotics and there's an issue. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Can I make
Jay, do you have anything else you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Mark's and Ravi's point, and it's going back to this: what are people going to use this toolkit for? And I really see, even though it was written directed at the healthcare professional, it really empowers both the professionals and the families. So I could certainly see groups that are tepid or still trying to seek knowledge, using it and helping to accelerate their internal processes and consensus building, et cetera. But on the other side, having patient families who may not be able to understand all the content that's in there, but they may be able to use that toolkit to advance within their own unit or relatives or whatever their space, to support sharing of knowledge and equalizing and opening the communication field, so that there's transparency around the decision to or not to use probiotics in a particular unit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just want to echo and emphasize the point raised about how families are really desperate for more information around issues that concern their child's health, and they deserve to know and to have access to that information. And also just acknowledging that probiotics are marketed, you know, and they're commercialized, they're available at the grocery store, and they're kind of out in the world. And it might be things that come up in conversation. And so the toolkit really helps to empower families to spark that conversation with their care team, and empowers the care team to be able to have an informed conversation back with the families, so that there is that collaboration, the information sharing that can happen. So thank you again for just acknowledging each of those points and the importance of open and honest communication. And the next question I have is around products. You know, the toolkit does not name any products, but I know that our audience and our community would like to know a little bit more. So without perhaps any, you know, naming any particular products or brands, what should, can you say a little bit more about what centers should be considering or keeping in mind as they're navigating this really challenging process about what to use?
I can jump in there. So I think probably some points to consider are the manufacturer. That's a reasonable place to start. And there's lots of details in the toolkit, but finding a reputable manufacturer that's following good manufacturing practices and has willingness to share their data about purity and viability. So purity just means, are the bugs in the probiotic product the ones that the label says they have? And several people have done studies where they just picked 10 or 12 or 15 probiotics off the shelf and tested them. And commonly you find that the list of organisms on the label doesn't match exactly with what you find. And then viability means how many live organisms are there? And that changes from the time it's manufactured until the time it's ingested. And that's influenced by the vehicle, whether it's a liquid or a powder, by how long it's been since it was manufactured, and by whether it's been kept in a freezer or a refrigerator or out on the shelf. And so having the capacity to address those questions, I think, are valuable. I would love to tell you that we know an exact dose that is perfect, and the short answer is we just don't. Ultimately, this field will need to do some dose escalation trials. There are a few in the literature, but not very many. And what that means is you start at a small dose and you increase that dose and see where the most effective point is. And it's likely that a dose for one strain of probiotic that's most effective is going to be different than a dose from another strain. And the studies are going to take money and time to come to be published. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about dose and about strain, but there are some things that we can know, and that is the reliability of the manufacturer and their data about product viability and purity. I think in addition to that, it's worth asking the question of, as we compare studies, are there some strains that have been more reliably effective at decreasing the risk of NAC and death than others? You have to remember those studies are difficult to do. So what we would love to have is studies where we compare probiotic A to probiotic B, rather than having one NICU compare probiotic A to placebo and another NICU compare probiotic B to placebo, and then look at those studies side by side. That's the only approach we really have right now, is to compare the studies that have been published. But we have to remember that each of those NICUs has a different baseline NEC rate. And so where you start influences whether the results of your study show a benefit or they don't. And we can't just confidently pool all the studies and say probiotic D is the winner. Instead, it's going to take long, hard studies where we gather a lot more data from large studies. I think there's some consensus in the field that the ideal study would be what's called a cluster randomized trial. What that means is including 50 or 100 NICUs and then randomizing them to either probiotic A or probiotic B for a year, and then having them cross over and switch from A to B or from B to A. Those are very expensive studies, but they really would be helpful at giving us the kind of answers we need. Until those kinds of studies are performed, and they'll have to include thousands of babies, we're left looking at things like what are the most pure, what are the most viable, and what are the apparently most effective probiotics out there. I saw a question in the question and answer about, are there improvements in regulation? And I think the FDA has been very interested in this question now for many years. And the FDA has been pretty firm in their stand, saying that in order for a probiotic to be marketed to prevent or mitigate or treat a disease, it has to be manufactured to very high standards, similar to vaccines. So they put probiotics in the same box as vaccines because they both potentially can contain live organisms. And the reality is most manufacturers are not willing to go through that process, in part because it's very expensive, in part because they can make more money selling their product as a dietary supplement or a generally regarded as safe product that they can then just sell over the counter, compared to marketing it as a drug and then selling it only with a prescription. And so I don't see the field changing in the short term. I don't think the FDA is suddenly going to reverse the stand they've had for 20 years. And I don't see probiotic manufacturers rushing to say, we're going to produce a product that will be available by prescription only and will have the same quality standards as a vaccine. That leaves us with uncertainty that's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I would agree with Mark that I don't expect the uncertainty of what strain we should use to be resolved anytime soon. You know, the comparative effectiveness trials are just the size of those trials to show an effect are going to have to be so large that I would anticipate, you know, the evidence we have today is likely going to be the evidence we're going to have for, you know, for the near term. But we do have a fair amount of evidence to base information and decisions on with regards to indirect comparisons. So approaches called network meta-analysis that can compare the effect of trials comparing strain A to placebo versus strain B to placebo and combining them. They come with limitations. They shouldn't be used by themselves, but those can be informative for clinicians. I would recommend people step back and look at what the data is as a whole. It may be that certain strains are more effective than others, but when you look at the data in trials of a whole variety of products used, that despite there being a large variety of products, most of the trials have shown reductions when analyzed with a variety of different products. And the same has been for reports from centers that have used that in the US, that they've shown reductions in their incidence of NEC and reported this. And several of the studies are linked with a wide variety of products. And so I think that's important to realize that if you're stuck on which product should I use, to know that centers that have used that and trials that have used a variety and that they've reported reductions in NEC with a variety of different products, with the caveat of thinking about, you know, quality and the manufacturer. Those are things I think that fortunately today, I think we're in a better spot than we might have been 10 years ago in terms of the options that centers and NICUs have for products that might undergo more testing for contaminants or come with kind of higher standards in terms of production and quality. And I think that's an advantage for centers.
I guess just to piggyback on those comments, I would say that it's true that probiotics are not regulated at the same way as pharmaceuticals right now, but that does not mean that they are not regulated. I often hear and often heard over the years, well, probiotics are not really regulated. That is not true. They're subject to many, many regulations. The difference is how the regulation scheme works. Drugs go through an incredibly complicated pre-approval process. Probiotics do not go through that process, but they are required to adhere to many safety regulations. There are labeling regulations that cover them. There's good manufacturing processes that they have to go through. And so really what it comes down to at the end of the day is, are you comfortable with the product that you're using? Have you assured yourself enough sufficiently about its purity, about that the bugs that it says that are on the label are actually there? And are you comfortable with the literature that's been out there about the product? And if you are, again, my personal opinion on this would be, don't get too hung up on this isn't the one product, because we are not probably going to have the one product for quite a long time. And the other flip side to that is, as I know Ravi has mentioned, benefits. Also take a hard look at what are the risks, what risks have been showing up in these studies. And those have been fortunately very minimal. So don't oversell yourself on the fact that the lack of an FDA approved product is something that means you need to run away from this subject.
Great. I want to try to get a couple more of our panel discussion questions in before we transition over to answer the Q&A questions that have come in. I'm hoping that you all can talk a little bit more about the different patient populations in the NICU and how that relates to probiotics and our toolkit. So a baby's gestation, their birth weight, and so forth, whether they're perhaps their term with a congenital heart disease, and that makes them at an increased risk of NEC. Can you share any of your expertise and how it relates back to the toolkit for centers that are using or interested in using probiotics to help prevent NEC?
So I could jump in on that. I think most of the studies and research have focused on very preterm babies. So the more preterm the baby and the smaller the baby, the higher the risk of NEC. That's the group that has been analyzed most carefully in terms of looking at the composition of the gut microbiota, which is the bacteria that live inside the intestine. That's the group where there's the best evidence that dysbiosis, meaning a disruption in that community of microbes, is associated with NEC. And that's where there's the most evidence for prevention of NEC with mom's own milk and with probiotics. Unfortunately, when we look at the term babies with NEC, they're a very unique group. And so when you look at babies who are born at term, and by term I mean after 37 weeks, the NEC incidence is pretty low. When you look at that whole population, it's about 1 per 10,000. But when you look at those cases, they fit into pretty discrete categories. Most of those babies either have congenital heart disease or gastroschisis, or have had some kind of hypoxic insult to the gut. And NEC happens earlier in life for those babies. And we don't have compelling evidence that intestinal dysbiosis is a primary risk factor for term babies with NEC, nor do we have really compelling evidence that breast milk, mom's milk, has as much of a protective effect in those term babies. And the limit and the data about probiotics for term babies, either with gastroschisis or congenital heart disease, is pretty minimal. There are a couple of randomized controlled trials. They're fairly small. I think at this point, we have pretty limited data saying that term NEC is similar to preterm NEC in terms of the beneficial effects of probiotics. So I think the best data are for small premature babies rather than term babies or even late preterm babies, those born at 35, 36 weeks gestation.
I would just add one more nuance to what Mark you were saying, is that on the term end, there's that tail off where we don't have that evidence for efficacy with probiotics. But on the other end, as we now go down to 22 weeks and 23 weeks, I think there's some concern that the data kind of is softer for the less than 1,000 grams, even in the data sets, and that the sweet spot seems to be in that 1,000 to 1,500 grams, where it's the sort of the maximum impact for probiotics. So I know some groups have sort of said they're based on the existing data, they would only going to use probiotics for that group, the 1,000 to 1,500 gram group, or given that there really hasn't been big harm, to just treat all under a certain gestation or a certain weight as a reasonable approach, with the understanding that maybe there are other benefits that we have not sort of collated for the smallest babies, because maybe it's much more multifactorial. Like, certainly the smallest babies have incredibly dysbiotic nature, and maybe they're just more resistant to being able to change with exogenous probiotics. One other comment that I think is relevant, and we've actually experienced it in one of our units, is the deployment, and in the toolkit talks about your own context. Where do you provide the probiotics? Is it from the pharmacy, or from the nutrition side, or done at the bedside, or in a different room, etc.? And we've certainly in one of our deployments had contamination occur and infection in one of our babies when it was decided in that context to do it in the unit. Other sites, we did it through the pharmacies, which is a completely different pathway. So I think it's really important to, one, really know your own system and where it would be the most confident for preparation and delivery. And then two, there's plenty of data out there that look at cross-contamination. So you may be treating one baby with a probiotic, and then the very next baby in a mixed unit, you may be having contamination that may jump from one bed to another and unexpectedly be exposed to that probiotic. So it's really important to kind of understand how you're delivering, whether it's powder or liquid, or where are you mixing it with the feed, etc., as part of your process, to minimize the risk for cross-contamination. I think the highest number I've seen in a study is almost 40% for cross-contamination, so it can be significant.
I want to emphasize, go ahead, Mark. Do you want to add something?
No, I just was going to make that quick comment. In the toolkit, we didn't really talk about how some of the probiotics that come in a liquid form or in an oil base. The oil base is nice for viability of the probiotic organism. Some of them have vitamin D added and some of them don't. And so I would just encourage the neonatologists and the dietitians to just be aware that you may be selecting a product based on which bug and the dose, but just be aware that some of them have added vitamin D, and that should just be something you're well aware of.
One point I want to emphasize is that for centers and clinicians who do use the toolkit, that we are really eager to hear from you all and learn back from you all who are using the toolkit, and bring you back to the Next Society to share your experience with the toolkit, and perhaps feature your experience on our webinars and at our next symposium, and different learning opportunities at our research roundtables and so forth. And so we really want to emphasize the importance of ongoing evaluation and documentation as you begin to use the toolkit. And so just wanted to throw it back over to our panelists. Is there anything else you want to emphasize, or insight regarding documentation and ongoing evaluation as it relates to the toolkit? Pretty clear. All right. So in a moment, we're going to transition over to answering the many questions that have been asked to us. Is there anything else that you all want to leave our audience with before we transition to answering their questions? I will just share that as someone who did not have access to probiotics for my baby in the NICU, I really just want to emphasize the importance of ensuring that families have access to information about whether your unit is using or not using, and the rationale behind that decision, so that families feel part of the decision and they understand how and why it's happening, and they are more likely to have faith and believe in the care team and the care that's being provided to their child. So just want to really emphasize that. Anything else that you want to share before we transition?
Maybe one other point that I think is valuable. probiotic organisms differ in their capacity to consume human milk oligosaccharides. And that may be something that's worth considering as you are trying to decide, do we want to use probiotics? Do we not? Are we using formula in our unit or not? That may influence your decision. Human milk oligosaccharides, as you may know, are small sugar molecules that are quite abundant in human milk. And they're fascinating because they're not digestible by the baby, and they're not digestible by most of the gut microbes that colonize small babies. And so finding both the right bug and the food for that bug, and in my mind, the ideal food for that bug is mom's milk, is potentially something to consider as you're trying to decide which strain might be most helpful in your unit. I would also say that when we think about donor milk, it has its challenges, both nutritionally and immunologically, and that's because it's pasteurized. But the nice thing about donor milk is it's a pooled product, and pasteurization doesn't impact human milk oligosaccharides. So when you're using donor milk, one of the nice things you're doing is giving a wide variety of human milk oligosaccharides. And since the baby can't use that as a nutrition source, it'd be nice to provide a bug that can potentially.
I just want to add one brief comment about the kind of what population and should you treat babies or supplement babies less than 1,000 grams, because I think that is a common kind of concern. And to balance the risk that those are the babies at the highest baseline risk of NEC. And so if that's the sticking point in your center for use, it might be that you focus on the more mature preterm infants and maybe over time consider more immature infants, but to also realize some of the clinical trials that those babies less than 1,000 grams who have a higher risk of intestinal perforation, that those infants might have clouded some of the data on the effect, and to consider the experiences, of which there are many centers reporting experiences in that less than 1,000 gram population as well, in terms of the effect it's had in routine use, and consider both of those pieces of data together.
More of a general comment about the toolkit. I think this whole intentional, the word intentional that Ravi used before, I really like, is that having this focus and spotlight on this area where you open a conversation and look at the data and talk it's a wonderful model to have better trust within the healthcare system with patient families. So I think this is a great example. If we could do this for all complex conditions, I think it'd be fantastic. So really take advantage of it kind of helping you accelerate that building that trust within your own community, because I think it's important. And the second and last point for me would be the data collection, being able to not just do and implement, but really make sure that you have something that you can read out, whether it's you're looking at your infection rates or your process measures, and just really making sure that you know that what you did was systematically implemented and compliance was good, and that you didn't hit particular roadblocks. So there's a lot of pre-work that's important, and I think encourage everyone who's going this pathway to really build up everything before you press the start button.
Cool. I'm gonna open up one of our last live poll presentation questions that you all are welcome to take a moment to answer as we begin to address some of the Q&A questions that have been asked to us. So someone asked whether there's information specifically like resources for families in our toolkit. And as Erin prior answered, yes, there is. There's actually a sheet that can be printed out separately, just like a one-page sheet, and there's different links and resources in the toolkit that are specific for patient families. So as everyone in the audience, you're welcome again to answer the live poll question as we kind of go through these. And team here on with me, if there's a particular question that you would like to answer and address, go for it. I'm just looking through these myself. I like this one, if you don't mind, Adam, this one's for you about consent. We didn't really get into that. So can you talk about whether you feel consent is recommended or necessary? Just any thoughts on and insight on that?
Sure. So again, my goal, I can't provide legal opinion about whether or not your center should provide consent or not. What I can tell you is that decision should be the result of a process. The same process in many respects as to whether or not you're using probiotics in the first place. Whatever decision you make about that, whether it is written consent, signed consent, verbal assent, or any of the variations that come into play, make a decision, make a thoughtful decision, write down somewhere why you made that decision, and go through the process that would enable you to write something down that makes sense. As a lawyer, I just want to be able to defend that decision as a reasonable decision. So I can't offer you what the medical advice is, but I'm looking at the process, and I think that the toolkit lays out a process that you can use to help inform yourselves as to whether you should be providing some level of informed consent or information or something along those lines.
That's really helpful. Anything else
Adam,
you all want to add?
I just wanted to just ask Adam to sort of follow up on that, maybe even a broader context, and maybe the answer is still just the same. I really appreciate your thoughts there. I understand that there are now cases where lawyers are suggesting that you need consent to give a baby formula, you need consent to give a baby donor milk, you need consent in order to use mom's milk. And I feel for these parents because in my view, it feels like every time we ask them to sign another piece of paper, or every time we ask them to make a decision, it feels like we're implying that we have no idea what the right answer is and we want them to decide, or we think that everything's risky and we just want to protect ourselves from litigation. Do you have any thoughts, just sort of on a broad level, about how helpful the process is? In my mind, it seems like the core value should be communication, but I'm very interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
Sure. I'm trying to be diplomatic about it. I will say that my perspective is, I almost always am in the role of a defense lawyer, defending hospitals and doctors and manufacturers. And what I want is I want doctors to make these decisions and not have lawyers control the practice of medicine. There are lawyers, usually the plaintiff's bar, who will want to second guess everything that happens when there is a baby who has suffered some sort of adverse health condition. And that's true for infants and it's true for adults as well, I should say. But that's why there's so much litigation in the medical, pharmaceutical, medical device space. As a defense lawyer, I just go back to my comment earlier. What matters is, did you go through a thoughtful, deliberative, reasoned process to arrive at whatever decision you made about informed consent, or whatever level of consent or information that you provide? Because that's when that decision becomes defensible in court. So whatever your center decides, just go through that process. And yes, there's always potentially somebody who's going to second guess it, but we can't stop that from happening. But what we can do is defend your process if you have one. So that's I hope that answers your question, Mark, and I hope that provides some insight to those of you watching as to how that plays out.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much.
I just want to emphasize again also that the toolkit, the link is in the chat box. And if you can't find the link in the chat box, the link to access and to be able to download and use the toolkit will be available on our website shortly. Team, are there other questions that you would like to address in the open Q&A or perhaps even in the chat box?
I'll touch on one of the questions, which is how long should we wait to look at our outcomes, which I think is a common question. We started using probiotics, we haven't seen a benefit yet. Is it not working? What do we do? And I would say the first level is, there's a reason we do clinical trials and studies is I think there has to be a certain amount of belief in the evidence that when you implement it, you really are relying on the evidence that's available. And for probiotics, we have synthesis of the evidence and meta-analysis that and then individual studies that when you implement it, that's, I think, what you rely on. I'll put that at the top level. And then, of course, you want to know if it is having an effect. The challenge with NEC when you're looking at that at individual centers, it's relatively common at most centers that you need to look at it for at least a couple of years. And within each period you're looking at it, ideally at least having 20 or so infants within that group. And so that's going to depend on who you're treating, how many babies you have. And so even if it's been a couple of years and you've not seen a reduction, I would say that may not necessarily mean that it's not working in the unit. It might just be the challenges with detecting differences in those units. But to track, my recommendation would be at least quarterly, looking at your NEC incidence by quarter and following that for at least 2 years, so eight quarters, to really know if that would be the earliest where I think you might really get some confidence in whether you're seeing a reduction. And fortunately, for many of the NICUs are part of Vaughan. That's a great place to use to look at the data, is using for your data that's already being collected. And for those that are part of the Vermont Oxford Network, that would be a great data source.
I saw a question about some protocols suggest discontinuing the use of probiotics at around 35 or 36 weeks. I think it's a valuable question. The questioner says, well, why not continue until discharge or even after discharge? And I think that comes down to what your goal is. If your goal is to decrease the risk of NAC, which is what most of these studies in preterm babies have looked at, the incidence of NAC drops off pretty dramatically between 35 and 36 weeks or 34 and 36 weeks. And so if you're trying to prevent NEC, you're probably not going to have a great benefit after 36 weeks. Preterm babies who get NEC after 36 weeks, there's probably a different process going on. If your goal is different than that, then you may decide to extend your probiotic use longer. I do that only with consultation with the parents. And so, some parents are very involved and interested in this question, and they share with me the data about probiotics for prevention of colic in term babies, and they've got a baby that meets the definition for colic, and they want to continue. And I think those are good discussions to have, where you can review the pros and cons of probiotics for colic with the family, and then make an individual distinction there.
There's an interesting question I thought about. The question was, are you concerned that we have no long-term safety data on the use of probiotics and outcome in preterm infants? And I don't believe I've seen a study on that, on long-term. I don't believe anybody's been followed that long. But I will say this about that question, and I don't mean to imply anything about the questioner who's anonymous. But over the last few years, there has been an enormous ramp up in people's discussion about medical issues as a result of COVID. And one of the common things that I've heard with regards to vaccinations recently is the lack of long-term safety data. So that is a concern that you might hear out there. From my perspective, what does that mean? What does long-term safety data mean? Do you mean 2 years? Do you mean 5 years? Do you mean 10 years? Do you mean 20 years? Most drugs that are approved do not have what I think lay people would refer to as long-term safety data associated with them, because otherwise the drugs would never get approved. It would take too long. And the same thing is true with most medical devices as well. So from a legal perspective, I'm not terribly concerned about that. From a medical perspective, it may be something that you think about, but that's up to the doctors, and I leave that in their realm.
I would just add a couple of points that the kind of maybe not as long term as what Adam refers to, but 2-year neurodevelopmental outcome data that has been evaluated in a small number of trials that show no suggestion of harm or benefit with 2-year outcomes. And I do think when you're thinking of what you're trying to achieve, if the goal is that you might achieve a reduction in NEC, sepsis, and mortality, those 3 outcomes that I think, at least from the meta-analysis, we would say are plausibly prevented by probiotic supplementation. I do think that those 3 outcomes, if you are important contributors to long-term data. There is some uncertainty, and maybe Mark wants to comment on this, about the persistence of certain strains, that some strains supplemented when you supplement and you stop, they kind of don't persist in the gut microbiome, and others do persist. And I do think that there is some uncertainty in value and kind of what the longer term effects of that are. And also to remember, in the context of the NICU and what are babies, the bacteria that preterm infants in the NICU are exposed to. I think it's always good to remember the context in which these infants are cared for.
Yeah, I agree with Ravi there. The challenge of most probiotic studies in the adult world is it's pretty clear that you can't substantively change the composition of the adult microbiota with a probiotic. While you're giving it, you can find some of those organisms in the poop, but once you stop, it goes away immediately. And that's common with many probiotics in babies as well. The exception goes back to the question of trying to pair a prebiotic and a probiotic. And so the prebiotic, of course, is the food for the probiotic microbe. And there are some data saying that if you're giving a baby a probiotic organism that is very good at consuming human milk oligosaccharides, that you can establish a stable colonization with that organism that can last for months, as long as the baby's still receiving human milk. But those data are mostly from term infants, not preterm infants. And so I don't know that we have very compelling evidence that we're going to have long-term impact with probiotic administration for the period of time that the baby is in the NICU. So, just to broaden that question, there are so many diseases that seem to be associated with intestinal dysbiosis. And that's the whole gut-brain, gut-lung, gut-kidney, gut-liver axis. But the evidence that we can actually decrease those chronic inflammatory diseases with probiotics is just not there yet. And so if your goal in giving a probiotic to a preemie in your NICU is to decrease his risk of asthma when he's 5 or Parkinson's when he's 85, we don't have those data at all.
One of the questions asked about cost, and it just opens up this sort of decisional where our group had gone through trying to decide what probiotic to use. And it was a long process. And I think we went through some of the points, and it's in the toolkit, about what are the characteristics that your group would want to use to grade and level out one probiotic choice against another. And cost was something that we wanted to deliberately put down lower than the other things that we mentioned about the evidence and the quality of the product, et cetera. But the one of the things that was very important pragmatically for us was to make since we had the momentum to choose something, that in some cases it's better to choose something than to not choose anything at all. And so I think the data's, because of the mix of different products that have been used in different studies, that it's reminiscent of when I think about how we jumped on surfactant and various different surfactant forms, and everyone had their favorite surfactant. But at the end of the day, we were using surfactant globally because we thought it was doing good. And in a way, that's the context that we kind of decided within the short list that we had, and ultimately the list kind of flipped back and forth, and we ended up choosing something that was consistent within our group. Do I believe that's going to be the probiotic for us in the next 10 years? Maybe not, but it was an initiation point for us to actually get through the process, get it implemented, and felt confident that it was a safe and reasonable product to get going with.
Thank you. Anything else that you all want to share or address before I begin to wrap us up with our closing slides? It's been a really wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much for your questions. So again, just want to highlight our NEC research priorities that we use to drive and accelerate the work that we're doing here to ensure that our work is focused on the most urgent and meaningful, impactful topics and questions to our patient, family, and clinician research population. And these are available on our website. In terms of what you can go off and do today, we hope that you will share and use our statement on probiotics and our toolkit. My colleague Erin Umberger has put the toolkit up on our website. It is now available under the clinicians tab, so you can go access it, download it, share it. Please do. We hope you will use it, and we hope that you will report back to us on what it has been like to use the toolkit. If you have suggestions, thoughts, insights, please share it with us. Please document, please evaluate your process, and then come back and report your outcomes and experience to us. If you haven't already, please register for the next symposium in San Diego. I'll share more about that in a moment. Stay tuned for the launch of our NEC registry that will be taking place this summer. It's very exciting. I hope that you will encourage your colleagues to check us out, join our email list, subscribe to our blog, and stay involved. You can also support our work at necsociety.org. As I mentioned, we are coming together for the first time since 2019. We'll be together in San Diego, August 28th to the 30th. For the next symposium in partnership with Cincinnati Children's. We have 3 different tracked sessions, lots of exciting content, over 60 faculty members. You don't want to miss this, so please be sure to register. And I should mention actually that registration goes up tomorrow. I don't know how tomorrow is already June 1st, but it is. So register today if you're going to register today, May 31st. Otherwise, you'll have to pay the non-early bird rate, and I apologize for that. I will spend maybe a quick 20 seconds asking if you are registered for the next symposium before I move it over to the next slide. I hope that your answer is a yes. As I mentioned, May has been NEC Awareness Month. Our theme has been transforming the devastating pain of this disease into the power that is accelerating our movement towards a vision and world without this devastating disease. My family was thrilled to make our matching donation. Thanks to all of you all in our community who gave generously. We in return gave generously as well. So really excited that we were able to make our matching donation. If you're inspired to give, you can also give at necrotizing.org. Thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you to Sweet Ezra's family for allowing us to dedicate today's webinar to Ezra. We are holding him in our hearts today and always. So thank you all so much again, and we will be back in touch with you again soon. Thanks, everyone.